Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most invasive bedroom policing operations. The medieval church's obsession with controlling women's bodies and intimate lives. Picture yourself as a medieval woman, lying next to your husband on a cold Tuesday night in 1347, desperately wanting some warmth and human connection. When suddenly you remember, oh wait, it's a fast day, and touching him could literally send you to hell. You probably won't survive the sheer frustration of living under these rules without developing some serious anxiety issues. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments below. All right, let's begin the story. You're living in medieval Europe, and the church doesn't just want your soul. It wants to micromanage your marriage bed with the dedication of an overzealous hall monitor. The year is 1215, and you've just gotten married to a merchant's son your father picked out. Congratulations. Now prepare for the most bizarre honeymoon experience imaginable, because the church has opinions, so many opinions, about when you can consummate this union. First, there's the calendar to consider. You pull out what looks like the world's most depressing planner, marked with more forbidden days than a modern diet chart. Sundays? Absolutely not. That's the Lord's Day. Wednesdays and Fridays? Those are fast days. So your body should be focused on spiritual hunger, not physical desire. Saturdays? Well, that's preparation for Sunday. So better not risk it. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were actually followed or just aspirational guilt trips from celibate clergymen. But the manuals they left behind suggest they were deadly serious. The math gets ridiculous fast. Advent season. That's about 4 weeks of no touching. Lent. Another 40 days of mandatory abstinence. Easter week? Don't even think about it. Pentecost. Whitsun week. Christmas week. All off limits. Add in feast days of major saints. Ember days. And rogation days. And you're looking at over half the year when marital intimacy could theoretically land you in spiritual hot water. One particularly enthusiastic theologian calculated that conscientious couples have about 44 days per year when relations were technically permitted. You might think, well, surely people ignored these rules. And you'd be partially right. But here's where it gets darker. The church had enforcement mechanisms there. Your priest would quiz you during confession, asking pointed questions about your bedroom activities. Did you lie with your husband during Advent? Did you engage in the marital act on the feast of St. Agnes? The penance for breaking these rules ranged from extra prayers to public humiliation to bread and water fasts that would make modern juice cleanses look indulgent. Some priests even provided helpful visual aids, actual calendars with little symbols indicating which nights were approved for conception attempts. One surviving manuscript from northern France shows tiny bed symbols on permitted days and crosses on forbidden ones. Imagine explaining that to house guests. Oh, that's just our church-approved sex schedule hanging next to the crucifix. The reasoning behind this scheduling nightmare reveals the medieval church's profound discomfort with human sexuality, especially women's sexuality. Sex, even within marriage, was seen as a necessary evil. Necessary for procreation, but evil because it involved pleasure. And pleasure was suspicious. Women, being the daughters of Eve, were considered especially prone to lust, and therefore needed extra supervision. Your husband might get a mild scolding for initiating on a feast day, but you'd bear the heavier guilt for tempting him. This system created a peculiar dynamic, where the church simultaneously insisted that wives must be available to their husbands, more on that nightmare in a bit, while also declaring most days unsuitable for such availability. It's like being told you must always answer your phone, but also that using your phone is usually sinful. The mental gymnastics required to navigate these contradictions would exhaust even the most devout medieval woman. And here's a quirky detail that medieval marriage manuals don't advertise. Some creative couples found loopholes. Technically, the rules often specified carnal knowledge or the completed act, so medieval lovers developed what we might delicately call workarounds, intimate activities that didn't quite cross the technical line. Of course, confession manuals quickly caught on and started listing these creative interpretations as equally sinful, leading to an arms race between human desire and ecclesiastical prohibition. You wake up one morning in your medieval household, stretch your arms, and catch a glimpse of yourself in the polished metal that serves as your mirror. Immediately, you feel a pang of guilt, vanity. The priests remind you every Sunday, is Satan's favorite gateway drug for women, your body. They've explained since you were old enough to understand, is basically a walking temptation factory that requires constant supervision and control. The theology behind this is fascinatingly twisted. According to the learned men of the church, women's bodies are inherently more sinful than men's because Eve ate the apple first. This original sin, they argue, left an especially deep stain on the female form, your curves, your softness, even your voice, all designed by the devil to lure good Christian men from the path of righteousness. One popular medieval text describes women's bodies as furnaces of lust that burn hotter than men's, requiring extra rules and restrictions to keep that fire from spreading. Take your hair, for instance. Right now, it's hanging loose around your shoulders, which would horrify your parish priest. Women's hair, you've been taught, is a net for catching souls, specifically men's souls. The moment you reach marriageable age, that hair must be covered, controlled, hidden away. Married women who let their hair show in public might as well be advertising their services at the local brothel. According to church teaching, you remember your mother carefully arranging her wimple each morning, making sure not a single strand escaped to corrupt the innocent. The covering rules get absurdly specific. Your hair must be completely hidden in church, of course, but also at market, while traveling, and even sometimes at home if male visitors are present. Wealthy women invest in elaborate headdresses that cost more than a peasant's yearly income, turning religious modesty into a competitive sport. The irony isn't lost on you. Covering your sinful hair with silk and jewels worth a small fortune, but the church seems more concerned with the hiding than the humility. Bathing presents another minefield of moral danger. The church views bathing with deep suspicion, especially for women. Public bathhouses, popular in many medieval towns, are denounced as stews of iniquity where women's wet, naked bodies might inspire lust. Even private bathing comes with warnings. Some priests insist you should bathe in your shift, never fully naked, lest you be tempted to touch yourself inappropriately or, heaven forbid, enjoy the sensation of warm water on your skin. You've heard whispers about the bathing rules at certain convents, where nuns are required to wear special bathing tunics with strategically placed openings for washing, ensuring they never see or touch their own bodies more than absolutely necessary. The fear of female flesh extends even to the women themselves. Your body is so dangerous that you shouldn't even look at it. The mirror prohibition ties into this perfectly. Mirrors, you're told, are tools of pride and lust. Women who spend too much time before mirrors are clearly obsessing over their appearance, which means they're thinking about attracting men, which means they're basically one step away from adultery. Some confessors actually ask how often you look in mirrors and prescribe penance accordingly. And 3 Hail Marys for a quick glance. A full rosary for actually fixing your hair while looking. But here's where the hypocrisy gets thick enough to cut with a knife. While you're not supposed to care about your appearance, you're also held responsible if your husband strays because you've let yourself go. Medieval marriage manuals written by churchmen somehow managed to insist that wives must be attractive enough to keep their husbands satisfied while never actually trying to be attractive. It's like being told to bake bread without mixing ingredients. Historians still argue whether these body-shaming rules were primarily about controlling women or about celibate men's deep discomfort with female sexuality. The answer is probably both. The sheer detail in some texts, describing exactly how women's bodies corrupt men's souls, suggests an obsession that goes beyond mere theological theory. One 13th century manual spends 3 pages describing the spiritual dangers of women's exposed ankles. 3 pages about ankles. The rules create a peculiar form of body dysmorphia, where you're taught to see your own flesh as enemy territory, your breasts, weapons of mass temptation, your hips, carved by demons to inspire lust, even your monthly bleeding. But we'll save that particular nightmare for later. The point is, every aspect of your physical existence requires management, suppression, and shame. Some women, of course, find ways to push back. You might accidentally let a few curls escape your wimple on market day, or take a bit longer at your ablutions than strictly necessary. The wealthy develop elaborate workarounds, technically modest clothing made from fabric so fine they cling to every curve, headdresses that cover the hair while drawing even more attention to the face. It's malicious compliance at its medieval finest. You're 12 years old, sitting in church while Father Benedict tells the story of St. Agnes again, sweet, pure Agnes, who chose death rather than marriage to a pagan, as he describes how she prayed for God to make her ugly, to repel her suitor, how she celebrated when soldiers came to execute her, rather than let any man touch her virgin body. You feel your stomach twist. This is the role model the church holds up for young girls. Death before defilement. Even if that defilement is just marriage to the wrong person. The cult of virgin martyrs dominates your religious education. There's Saint Agatha, who had her breasts cut off rather than submit to a Roman governor's advances. The church celebrates this mutilation, holding up her severed breasts on a platter in religious art, like some grotesque baking display. You're supposed to pray to her for strength against sexual temptation, as if the lesson here is that you should prefer torture to physical intimacy. Then there's St. Lucy, who gouged out her own eyes when a suitor complimented them, presenting them to him on a plate with a note saying, "Now you have what you desired." The priest tells this story with approval, as if self-mutilation is a reasonable response to unwanted male attention. You glance around the church and see other young girls listening with wide, frightened eyes. The message is crystal clear. Your body parts are so dangerous that removing them might be preferable to letting them tempt men. The virgin martyr stories share a disturbing pattern. Young girl pledges virginity to Christ. Pagan man wants to marry or rape her. She refuses. Terrible tortures ensue. Described in loving detail. She dies happy. Virginity intact. The end. Rinse and repeat for dozens of saints. Each story more gruesome than the last. St. Catherine broken on a wheel. St. Ursula and her 11s. 1,000 virgin companions slaughtered by Huns. St. Maria Goretti, stabbed to death at age 11 for refusing her would-be rapist. What's particularly twisted is how these stories frame sexual assault. The martyrs aren't just killed for being Christian. They're specifically killed for refusing sex. And this refusal is portrayed as the height of holiness. The implication seeps into your young mind. If you're ever assaulted, did you resist hard enough? Did you pray loud enough? Would you choose death like the saints? Or are you weak, sinful, less worthy of God's love? You notice how the virgin martyrs are always described as beautiful, devastatingly, irresistibly beautiful. Their beauty is both their curse and their virtue, drawing men like moths to flame, but also proving their spiritual strength when they reject all advances. It's a no-win game that starts to feel familiar. Be beautiful, but don't enjoy it. Attract men, but reject them. Have a body, but wish you didn't eat. The church goes beyond just telling these stories. It builds an entire culture around virgin martyrdom. There are feast days where young girls dress in white and parade through town carrying palm fronds, play acting at martyrdom. You've participated in these processions, feeling simultaneously special and terrified. The older women watch approvingly as you and your friends recite poems about preferring death to dishonor. But you catch something else in their eyes too, a weariness, maybe even regret. Here's a detail the priests don't mention, but you learn from whispered conversations. Many of these virgin martyrs were incredibly young. Agnes was 12 or 13. Maria Goretti was 11. Philomena was 13. The church holds up children choosing death over sexual contact as the ultimate form of purity, which sends a pretty clear message about what it thinks of adult women who have sex, even within marriage. The psychological impact of this virgin martyr cult on medieval women is something historians still debate. Some argue it gave women a form of power, the ability to choose religious life over marriage, to claim divine authority for rejecting unwanted suitors. Others point out the obvious trauma of teaching girls that rape is a fate worse than death, that their only value lies in their virginity, that suffering is noble and pleasure is sin. You see the effects in your own community. There's Marjorie, who joined a convent at 14 after swearing she'd rather die than marry. There's Alice, who wears a hair shirt under her dress and fasts until she faints, trying to mortify her flesh like the saints. There's your own sister, who cries for hours after her wedding night, convinced she's lost God's favor by losing her virginity. Even though the church supposedly sanctions marriage, the truly insidious part is how the virgin martyr cult creates a hierarchy of female virtue. At the top are the virgin saints, dead and perfect. Below them, consecrated virgins living in convents. Then, married women who only have sex for procreation. At the very bottom, widows who remarry and women who actually enjoy their marriage beds. You learn early that your value as a woman is inversely proportional to your sexual experience, even when that experience is church approved. Some women find ways to weaponize these stories. If Saint Agnes could refuse marriage for religious reasons, why can't they? Convents fill with daughters who prefer scholarship to childbirth, who'd rather illuminate manuscripts than submit to husbands. It's a form of resistance wrapped in the church's own logic. You can't argue with a girl who says she's following the Virgin Martyr's example. You're lying in bed, exhausted from a day of managing the household, tending to sick children, and helping with the harvest. Your body aches, your head pounds, and all you want is sleep. Then your husband's hand slides across your hip, and your heart sinks, not because you don't love him. You might, if you're lucky, but because church law is brutally clear, you cannot refuse. Welcome to the medieval doctrine of the conjugal debt, where your body is quite literally not your own. The theology behind this particular piece of misery comes from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Medieval churchmen took this line and ran with it like they were competing in some kind of oppression Olympics. The conjugal debt means that whenever your husband wants sex, you must provide it. No exceptions. Well, almost no exceptions. Those calendar restrictions from earlier still apply. creating a confusing maze where you must always say yes, except on the days when saying yes sends you to hell. At Thomas Aquinas, that celebrated theologian whose writings shape church law, explains it with chilling clarity. Refusing your husband is a mortal sin, not just any sin, a mortal sin, the kind that damns your soul to eternal hellfire. He reasons that by denying your husband, you might drive him to adultery or masturbation, and his sin would be on your head, your exhaustion, illness, or simple lack of desire. Irrelevant. Your body is a debt you owe, payable on demand. The confessional becomes a special kind of torture chamber for married women. Have you refused your husband? The priest asks through the screen. If you say yes, you're assigned penance, prayers, fasting, sometimes public humiliation. But here's the truly twisted part. If you confess to submitting despite not wanting to, some priests will lecture you about the importance of proper wifely enthusiasm. You're not just required to provide sex. You're supposed to be grateful for the opportunity. You hear stories that make your skin crawl. Marie down the lane submitted to her husband 3 days after giving birth because he insisted, and the midwife said refusing would be sinful. Catherine in the next village performed her duty while burning with fever because the priest told her illness was no excuse. These aren't cautionary tales. They're held up as examples of proper wifely virtue. The conjugal debt creates a particular kind of mental torture. You must always be available, but never eager. Too much enthusiasm makes you a whore. You must submit, but not enjoy. Pleasure for its own sake is sinful. You must be simultaneously passive and active, resisting enough to prove your modesty, but not so much that you commit the mortal sin of refusal. It's like trying to dance on the head of a pin while juggling flaming torches. Some husbands, to their credit, ignore these rules, and your friend Margaret's husband actually asks her consent and respects her refusals, though she admits in whispered conversations that she feels guilty every time she says no. The church's teachings have wormed so deeply into her mind that she can't enjoy her husband's consideration without feeling like she's failing in her Christian duty. That's the genius of the system. It makes women complicit in their own oppression. The enforcement mechanisms go beyond just confession. Marriage contracts sometimes specifically mention the conjugal debt. Ecclesiastical courts, yes, the church has its own courts, can actually prosecute women for persistent refusal. You've heard of cases where husbands bring their wives before church tribunals, accusing them of denying their marital rights. The wives rarely win these cases. The standard punishment involves public penance and stern warnings about the state of their immortal souls. But wait, it gets worse. While you can never refuse your husband, he can absolutely refuse you. The debt, you see, flows primarily in one direction. If you desire intimacy and he doesn't, you're expected to pray for the grace to overcome your lustful nature. Some confession manuals actually prescribe penance for women who initiate sexual contact with their own husbands. Wanting your spouse is apparently more sinful than being raped by him. Historians still argue about how strictly these rules were followed in practice. Some point to court records showing women successfully claiming their husbands were making excessive demands, though excessive apparently meant multiple times per day, not just whenever he felt like it. Others note the existence of folk songs and stories mocking overly demanding husbands, suggesting some cultural pushback against the doctrine. The medical establishment, such as it is, occasionally provides unexpected loopholes. Some physicians argue that sex during menstruation could cause leprosy in any resulting children, giving women a church-approved excuse for several days each month. Others claim that sex too soon after childbirth could curdle the mother's milk, potentially extending the postpartum restriction period. These medical exceptions become precious shields against unwanted demands. You develop strategies. Of course, a sudden religious vocation requiring extra prayer time, mysterious female ailments that flare up conveniently. Some women become quite creative. One manual warns confessors to watch for wives who deliberately eat garlic or onions to repel their husbands, which suggests this was common enough to require official notice. It's a form of resistance that has to remain subtle, hidden, deniable. You feel the familiar cramping in your belly and know what's coming. Within hours, you'll be transformed from a respectable married woman into something almost untouchable, a walking contamination that must be carefully managed and contained. Your monthly bleeding has arrived, and with it comes a set of restrictions so bizarre that even you, raised in this world, sometimes can't believe they're real. According to the Church's interpretation of Leviticus, you're now officially unclean, not just physically messy, spiritually contaminated in a way that can actually infect others. The theology gets wild here. Some priests claim that your touch during menstruation can sour wine, tarnish mirrors, rust iron, and kill plants. One widely circulated text insists that bees will abandon their hives if a menstruating woman walks by. You're basically a walking biblical plague for 5 to 7 days each month. The isolation begins immediately. In your household, you move to a separate sleeping area, if you're wealthy enough to have one. Poorer women make do with pallets on the floor, away from their husbands' beds. You cannot touch your husband, obviously, but the restrictions go far beyond that. You're not supposed to prepare food, especially anything that will be preserved like pickles or cured meats, because your uncleanliness will spoil them. Some households have special sets of dishes for menstruating women, marked with red paint so no one accidentally uses them. Church attendance becomes complicated. Many parishes ban menstruating women entirely, while others designate special areas, usually by the door. As far from the altar as possible, you stand with the other unclean women, feeling the weight of communal shame. Some churches go further, requiring menstruating women to enter through a separate door or wait outside entirely, listening to Mass through windows like lepers. The communion question sparks fierce theological debates. Or, can an unclean woman receive the body of Christ? Most priests say absolutely not. Your contamination would be an insult to the sacrament. Others argue for spiritual communion, where you meditate on receiving Christ without actually touching the host. You've seen women weep openly when turned away from communion, their natural bodily function treated as a barrier between them and God. But here's where it gets even stranger. While you're too contaminated to touch holy things, you're simultaneously believed to have weird supernatural powers. Menstrual blood, according to popular belief, can cure leprosy, ward off demons, and make love potions irresistibly strong. The same substance that makes you unfit for church supposedly has magical properties that terrify and fascinate in equal measure. You're both less than human and more than human, powerless and dangerous. Your children present another heartbreak. In many communities believe you shouldn't touch your own babies while bleeding. Your contamination might pass to them through breast milk or simple contact. Wealthy women hire wet nurses for these days, while poorer mothers watch other women feed their infants, their arms aching with the desire to hold their own children. The psychological torture of being deemed too unclean to comfort your crying baby is a special kind of hell the Church seems to have designed just for women. The practical logistics of medieval menstruation add another layer of misery. You use rags, of course, changed and washed in secret, because even the evidence of your bleeding is considered shameful. Some women fashion primitive belts to hold the cloths in place. Others simply layer their clothing and hope for the best. The washing of these rags must be done separately from other laundry, the water disposed of carefully lest it contaminate the ground. Or medical theories about menstruation range from bizarre to actively harmful. physicians, influenced by ancient Greek texts, believe menstruation is your body's way of expelling excess blood and toxic humors. Too little bleeding means the toxins build up, causing hysteria and madness. Too much means you're obviously oversexed and need cooling treatments. The normal amount is whatever doesn't inconvenience the men around you. Historians still debate whether these extreme menstruation taboos were universally followed or primarily aspirational. Evidence suggests wide variation. Urban areas often had stricter enforcement than rural communities, where women's labor was too valuable to lose for a week each month. Some regions developed local customs that softened the rules, like allowing menstruating women to attend church if they stood behind a special screen. The resistance takes subtle forms. Women develop elaborate codes to discuss their cycles without using forbidden words, and they share remedies for cramps and heavy bleeding in whispered conversations at the well. Some deliberately use their unclean time as a break from exhausting household duties, exaggerating symptoms to extend their isolation. If the church insists on treating you like you have the plague, might as well get some rest out of it. You learn to navigate the monthly transformation with a mixture of resentment and resignation. The cramping, bleeding, and physical discomfort are nothing compared to the social humiliation and spiritual isolation. Each month, you're reminded that your body, the body that births children, feeds families, and keeps households running, is considered so fundamentally dirty that God himself supposedly can't stand to be near you. You've just given birth after 18 hours of agony, and as you hold your newborn daughter, exhausted but euphoric, the midwife delivers news that sours your joy. 80 days until churching. My dear, it's a girl. Your heart sinks, eh? Not only are you banned from leaving your house except for emergencies, you're considered too spiritually contaminated to enter a church for nearly 3 months. Had you birthed a son, it would only be 40 days. Apparently, creating female life makes you twice as unclean. The churching ceremony, or purification of women after childbirth, is one of the church's most psychologically complex rituals, based on Jewish purification laws that Christianity supposedly superseded. It persists with remarkable tenacity. You're told, it's not about punishment or shame. It's about thanksgiving for surviving childbirth. But the reality feels different when you're forced to wait outside the church door like a beggar, holding a candle, while the priest decides if you're clean enough to rejoin the Christian community during your confinement. The restrictions pile up like stones. You cannot enter any consecrated ground, not just churches, but churchyards, shrines, or blessed spaces. You cannot touch holy water or religious objects. Some regions ban you from drawing water from communal wells. As if your postpartum body might poison the entire village, you're essentially under house arrest, dependent on others for anything requiring you to leave your home. The theology behind this is a masterpiece of misogynistic interpretation. Eve's curse, they explain, means childbirth inherently defiles women. Never mind that you've just participated in God's command to be fruitful and multiply. The act of giving life somehow makes you spiritually dirty. Mary, of course, didn't need purification because she gave birth as a virgin, remaining intact. The implication that normal childbirth involves a corruption that virgin birth avoids adds another layer of shame to your already exhausted body. Your neighbors enforce these rules with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some women sneak you small comforts, a blessed medal hidden in bread, holy water in an unmarked vessel. Others patrol the boundaries of your contamination like guard dogs, reporting any violations to the priest. You've heard of women forced to do public penance for attending their own mother's funeral during their confinement period. Grief, apparently, doesn't override postpartum uncleanliness. The 40 versus 80-day distinction based on your baby's sex reveals the church's hierarchy in stark terms. Boy babies make you unclean, but girl babies make you filthier. Some texts explain this by claiming female fetuses sit on the left side of the womb, the sinister side, and take longer to form, thus requiring extended purification. The fact that you've just produced another potential Eve, another walking temptation, doubles your contamination time. When churching day finally arrives, the ritual humiliation continues. You must wait outside the church, sometimes in rain or snow, until the priest comes to fetch you. You're required to wear a veil and carry a lighted candle, symbols of penitence and enlightenment. The priest reads prayers over you, emphasizing your unworthiness and God's mercy in accepting you back despite your defilement. Only then can you enter the church. Make an offering, yes, you have to pay for this privilege, and receive communion. Some women find the churching ceremony meaningful, even empowering, after months of dangerous pregnancy and the trauma of medieval childbirth. Being formally welcomed back into the community can feel like a celebration of survival. Historians still argue whether churching was primarily oppressive or if women found ways to make it serve their needs, a rare moment when they were the center of religious attention, when their survival was publicly acknowledged. But the darker implications are hard to ignore. Women who die in childbirth before churching face theological complications. Are they buried in consecrated ground? Can masses be said for their souls? The answer varies by region and priest, but the uncertainty adds another layer of anxiety to an already dangerous time. Some women insist on emergency churching ceremonies when birth complications arise. Terrified of dying in a state of impurity, the medical establishment complicates things further. Physicians warn that leaving the house too soon after birth can cause your womb to fall out or your milk to dry up. They prescribe extended bed rest that conveniently aligns with church teachings about confinement. Whether this is genuine medical concern or doctors reinforcing religious control is impossible to untangle. The result is the same. Weeks of isolation when you most need community support. You develop coping mechanisms. Women create their own support networks, visiting each other during confinement despite the rules. They share practical advice about healing from birth trauma, managing breast pain, and dealing with colicky babies. These informal gatherings become a kind of shadow church, offering the spiritual and emotional support the actual church denies. The irony isn't lost on you. The church venerates Mary as the ultimate woman, while simultaneously treating actual childbearing women as spiritual lepers. It demands you produce children for God's glory, while insisting the process makes you too dirty for God's house. You're essential and disposable, sacred and profane, needed and rejected. The psychological whiplash of navigating these contradictions while recovering from childbirth and caring for a newborn would break a weaker soul. You're a widow now, dressed in black from head to toe, and the church has very specific ideas about what you should do with the rest of your life. Your husband died 3 months ago, and while you're still processing your grief, or perhaps your relief, depending on what kind of marriage you had, the pressure has already begun. Remarry quickly to avoid the temptation of lust, says your brother-in-law. Join a convent immediately, says your priest. Whatever you do, don't you dare enjoy your newfound independence, says everyone. The official mourning period stretches before you like a prison sentence for a full year. You must wear nothing but black, cover your hair completely, avoid all social gatherings, and essentially perform grief whether you feel it or not. The church mandates this spectacular display of sorrow, complete with regular visits to your husband's grave and daily prayers for his soul. Skip any of these requirements, and you'll be branded a heartless wife who probably poisoned him for his money. But here's the catch-22 that makes widowhood particularly tortuous. While you must perform extreme grief, you're also viewed with deep suspicion as a suddenly single woman. Widows, the church teaches, are especially prone to lust because they've known the pleasures of the marriage bed. You're like a lit fuse of sexual desire, ready to explode into fornication at any moment. St. Jerome cheerfully wrote that widows burn with worse lust than virgins because they know what they're missing. Thanks, Jerome. The economic pressures come fast and hard. Your husband's family wants his property back. The church wants donations for masses for his soul. An endless stream of payments to reduce his time in purgatory. The local lord wants his death tax. Meanwhile, you're trying to figure out if you have any legal right to the business you helped build, the house you maintained, the children you birthed. The answer often depends on whether you remarry and to whom. The church's official position on widow remarriage reveals its spectacular hypocrisy. Paul said it's better to marry than burn with desire. So technically, widows can remarry. But the church also teaches that second marriages are inferior, a concession to weakness rather than a blessed union. Third marriages basically legalize prostitution. One influential theologian compared serial marriage to a dog returning to its vomit, which really sets the romantic mood. If you're young and wealthy, the pressure to join a convent intensifies. Your family might see it as a perfect solution. Your dowry goes to the church. You're safely contained, and they don't have to worry about you making an unsuitable second marriage. The priest paints convent life in glowing terms: spiritual fulfillment, education, freedom from worldly concerns. He doesn't mention the strict hierarchy, physical deprivations, and the fact that many convents are essentially prisons for inconvenient women. Some widows discover that their new status comes with unexpected power. For the first time in your life, you might actually control property, make contracts, run a business. The guild that barely tolerated you as a wife might accept you as a widow, continuing your husband's trade. You can go to court, make a will, choose where to live. It's a heady freedom that makes the church's pressure to remarry or become a nun feel even more suffocating. The social isolation of widowhood cuts deep. Married women view you as a threat. What if you seduce their husbands with your desperate widow lust? Single men see you as either easy prey or damaged goods. The church helpfully reinforces these attitudes by requiring widows to sit in a special section during Mass, physically separated from both maidens and wives. You're a living reminder of mortality and the dangers of female autonomy. Historians still debate how many widows actually remarried versus how many found ways to maintain their independence. The records suggest wide variation based on age, wealth, and regional customs. In some Italian cities, wealthy widows became powerful figures, patronizing arts and controlling vast business networks. In other regions, most widows remarried within months, driven by economic necessity or family pressure. The resistance strategies widows develop are particularly creative. Some take religious vows, but remain in their own homes, becoming vowesses who enjoy spiritual status without convent restrictions. Others claim ongoing mourning to avoid remarriage pressure. I couldn't possibly dishonor my dear husband's memory becomes a shield against unwanted suitors. A few bold widows simply ignore the rules, wearing colors, conducting business, and scandalizing their communities. You learn to navigate the narrow path between performing acceptable widowhood and maintaining some scrap of autonomy. You wear the black, but add small personal touches. You attend Mass in the widows section, but build friendships with other women there. You pray for your husband's soul, while secretly thanking God for your freedom. The church wants you to be a perpetual mourner or a cloistered nun, but you're discovering there might be other options. The widowhood rules reveal the Church's fundamental anxiety about uncontrolled women. A virgin is her father's property. A wife is her husband's. But a widow, she's dangerously close to being her own person. The elaborate restrictions around widowhood, the mourning requirements, the remarriage shame, the convent pressure, all serve to contain this threat. They can't quite figure out what to do with a woman who's neither maid nor wife, so they try to make her disappear into grief or God. You kneel in the confessional, palms sweating. As Father Thomas begins his questioning, you've confessed to the usual sins: pride, gossip, skipping prayers. But now he's moving into territory that makes your cheeks burn. When you lie with your husband, he asks through the wooden screen, do you assume positions other than what nature intended? Your mind races. What exactly does nature intend? And how specific does this confession need to get? The confession manual he's working from contains questions that would make a brothel madam blush. Medieval priests are equipped with exhaustively detailed lists of sexual interrogations designed to root out every possible variation from the Church-approved single position, missionary. Him on top. You lying still like a dead fish. Have you been on top? Have you used your mouth? Have you touched yourself or allowed him to touch you for pleasure rather than procreation? Each question feels like another layer of humiliation. The theoretical foundation for this sexual interrogation is impressively twisted. Sex, the Church maintains, is only acceptable for making babies. Any position, technique, or timing that might reduce the chance of conception or, God forbid, increase pleasure is therefore sinful. The priests have charts, actual charts detailing which acts are venial sins, minor spiritual misdemeanors, versus mortal sins, straight to hell. Do not pass purgatory. Your sex life is literally being graded by celibate men with rubrics. You've heard whispers about what happens to women who confess too much. Margaret from the baker's shop admitted to enjoying her marriage bed and spent 3 months doing public penance, standing outside the church in a white sheet holding a candle. Anne, the merchant's wife, confessed to initiating intimacy with her husband and was assigned daily flagellation. The message is clear. Confess enough to avoid hell, but not so much that you become the town cautionary tale. The questioning gets incredibly specific about timing and frequency. How often do you submit to your husband? Too rarely. And you're failing in your wifely duties. Too often. And you're clearly lustful. Do you engage in the marital act during your monthly courses? That's a mortal sin. While pregnant? Debatable. Some say it's sinful because it can't lead to conception. Others argue it prevents the husband from straying. Have you ever experienced pleasure? This is the trap question. Say yes, and you're a whore. Say no, and he might probe deeper, suspecting you're lying. The power dynamic in these confessions is obviously horrific. You're required to share your most intimate moments with a man who's theoretically never experienced them, who's been trained to see your body as a source of sin, and who holds your eternal salvation in his hands. Some priests are clearly getting off on these interrogations, pressing for more and more detail under the guise of spiritual guidance. Others seem genuinely disturbed by having to ask, rushing through the questions with obvious discomfort. But here's where it gets truly surreal. While drilling you about every microscopic detail of your marital relations, the same priests often remain willfully ignorant about actual sexual violence, a husband forcing himself on an unwilling wife. That's not even considered possible. The conjugal debt means consent is irrelevant. A woman assaulted by someone other than her husband. The questions focus on whether she experienced any pleasure or could have fought harder, not on the trauma of the attack. The penance assigned for sexual sins creates its own special hell. For confessing to pleasure, you might be required to abstain from the marriage bed for weeks or months, punishment that also affects your innocent or not so innocent husband for unnatural positions. You could face public humiliation, pilgrimages, or bread and water fasts. The irony of celibate men prescribing sexual abstinence as punishment for married women seems lost on everyone involved. Some confession manuals reveal unintentionally hilarious levels of sexual ignorance among the clergy. One widely circulated text warns against a position that's anatomically impossible, suggesting the author's understanding of female anatomy comes entirely from fevered imagination. Another describes acts that would require gymnastic abilities beyond most medieval couples' capabilities. You wonder how many women have been assigned penance for things they couldn't physically do if they tried. Historians still argue about whether these intrusive confessions were standard practice or exceptional overreach. Evidence suggests wide variation. Urban areas with educated clergy might face more detailed interrogation, while rural priests might stick to basics. Some women report never being asked such questions, while others describe confessionals that felt more like sexual inquisitions. The resistance takes subtle forms. Women develop coded language to confess without detail. "I have sinned in the marital bed" becomes a catch-all that technically fulfills the requirement without providing fodder for priestly imagination. Some coordinate their confessions, agreeing to all give the same vague answers. Others simply lie, figuring that God understands their marriages better than Father Thomas ever could. You leave the confessional with your assigned penance, 3 paternosters and a week of fasting. Relatively light, considering what you didn't confess. The mental gymnastics required to navigate these interrogations exhaust you more than any physical penance could. You're expected to be sexually available to your husband while feeling no desire, to confess your sins while revealing nothing, to be honest with God while lying to his representatives. It's enough to make anyone consider converting to a religion with less interest in their bedroom activities. You're examining the strange metal contraption in the merchant's back room, trying to understand how this torture device is supposed to protect your virtue. The chastity belt, an iron girdle with locks and metal plates, looks more like an instrument of war than anything that should touch human skin. The merchant assures you it's the latest fashion among noble wives whose husbands are joining the crusades, guaranteed to preserve your honor, he says, while you wonder if it's guaranteed to give you blood poisoning first. The myth versus reality of chastity belts reveals layers of medieval anxiety about women's sexuality. While popular imagination pictures every medieval woman locked in iron underwear, historians now argue these devices were far rarer than previously thought. Most surviving examples date from the 19th century, created by Victorian men with overactive imaginations about the Dark Ages. But the concept, the idea that women's sexuality needed physical locks and keys, absolutely permeated medieval thinking. The actual devices used to control women's sexuality were often more subtle and infinitely crueler. Take the girdle of chastity, not a metal device, but a blessed cord worn around the waist, supposedly imbued with holy power to suppress lust. You know women who've worn these cords until they embedded in their flesh, creating infected wounds they saw as badges of spiritual honor. The physical pain supposedly helped distract from sexual thoughts, as if medieval women had nothing better to think about than sex. Then there are the chemical interventions, and wise women and physicians prescribe an alarming array of substances to reduce female desire. Camphor applied to the genitals, lettuce seed potions, cold baths, and drinks made from water lily roots. The logic seems to be that if they can't lock up your sexuality physically, they'll try to chemically castrate it. Some of these remedies are merely unpleasant. Others, like the mercury-based concoctions sometimes recommended, are genuinely dangerous. The church develops its own version of chastity enforcement through clothing. Hair shirts, rough garments worn against the skin to cause constant irritation, become popular among women trying to prove their virtue. You've seen the welts and sores these create, the way women flinch when fabric brushes against their tormented skin. But that's the point. Every movement reminds you to resist the flesh, to focus on spiritual rather than physical sensations. More disturbing are the surgical interventions whispered about in medical texts. Physicians discuss procedures to restore virginity through crude surgeries, sewing torn hymens before wedding nights. Others recommend cauterization of the clitoris for women deemed too lustful, though finding medieval doctors willing and able to perform such procedures seems mercifully rare. The fact that these ideas exist in medical literature reveals how far the establishment will go to control female sexuality. The social chastity enforcement mechanisms often work better than any physical device. The culture of surveillance means your every move is watched, reported, judged. That time you smiled at the blacksmith, noted. The way your hips swayed while walking to market, suspicious. The fact that you seemed too happy in your marriage, clear evidence of excessive lust. The invisible cage of constant observation and judgment constrains more effectively than any iron belt. You learn about the tests used to verify chastity and virginity. Midwives inspect young brides, looking for intact hymens. Never mind that riding horses, physical labor, or simple anatomy might affect this meaningless membrane. Urine is examined for clarity. Cloudy urine supposedly indicates sexual activity. Some regions practice fumigation, where women sit over burning herbs and the reaction supposedly reveals their sexual status. It's medical theater designed to humiliate and control. The double standards around chastity devices and practices reveal spectacular hypocrisy, while your sexuality requires locks, potions, and constant surveillance. Your husband visits bathhouses staffed by prostitutes, while you wear hair shirts to suppress desire. He jokes with friends about his conquests. The same merchant selling you a chastity belt probably has a mistress in the next town. Men's sexuality is natural, even celebrated. Yours is a dangerous beast requiring constant restraint. Historians still debate whether the emphasis on female chastity reflected genuine belief in women's dangerous sexuality or masked men's anxieties about their own inadequacies. The elaborate lengths to which medieval society goes to control women's bodies suggest deep insecurity. If women were naturally modest and disinterested in sex, as some theologians claimed, why all the locks and surveillance? The contradictions reveal a culture at war with itself over female sexuality. Some women find ways to weaponize chastity culture for their own protection. Claiming a vow of chastity can deflect unwanted suitors. Wearing visible symbols of virtue, crosses, pilgrim badges, prayer beads, creates a kind of armor against harassment. Some clever women use chastity vows to control their own reproduction, spacing pregnancies or avoiding them altogether, under the guise of spiritual devotion. The real tragedy is how deeply these messages penetrate your own thinking, and you find yourself monitoring your own desires, feeling guilty for normal human responses. A flutter of attraction becomes a source of shame. The pleasure of your marriage bed feels like betrayal of your spiritual duties. The chastity belt might be a myth, but the mental cage the church builds around your sexuality is all too real. You watch as the wet nurse puts your newborn daughter to her breast, feeling that familiar pang of guilt mixed with relief. The church and your husband's family have convinced you that breastfeeding is beneath a woman of your status, that it will ruin your figure, make you too attached to the child, and worst of all, prevent you from conceiving again quickly. Your breasts ache with unused milk, bound tightly with linen strips, while another woman nourishes the baby you carried for 9 months. The theology around wet nursing reveals the Church's breathtaking ability to twist natural processes into moral complications. And milk, they explain, carries moral qualities from the nurse to the child. A wet nurse's character literally flows into your baby with every feeding. This creates an entire industry of investigating potential nurses, their sexual history, temperament, diet, and even their thoughts must be pure enough to nourish your noble offspring. You interview woman after woman, rejecting them for infractions like laughing too loudly or having red hair, obviously a sign of lustful temperament. The class dynamics make this particularly grotesque. The wet nurse feeding your child has often just lost her own baby or has been forced to wean her own infant early to take this position. She'll feed your child while her own goes hungry, all because the Church has convinced wealthy women that their bodies are too refined for such animal functions. You've heard of wet nurses whose own children died of malnutrition while they fed the babies of the rich, a sacrifice the Church frames as noble service. But here's where it gets truly twisted. While you're not supposed to breastfeed because it's too base and physical, you're also shamed for the emotional distance this creates. Priests lecture about maternal coldness, about women who care more for their figures than their children. You can't win. Feed your baby and you're an animal. Don't feed your baby and you're unnatural. The mental gymnastics required to navigate this contradiction would exhaust Solomon himself. The medical establishment adds its own layer of insanity. Physicians warn that breastfeeding will drain your vital essences, age you prematurely, and make your husband find you repulsive. They prescribe elaborate treatments to dry up your milk quickly, tight bindings, herbs, even bloodletting. Meanwhile, these same doctors insist that the wet nurse must follow strict dietary rules because everything she eats affects the baby. Apparently, noble breasts produce inferior milk, but peasant breasts must be carefully monitored, and the sexual implications of wet nursing create another minefield. The Church teaches that breastfeeding women shouldn't have sex because the exertion will curdle their milk. This gives wet nurses a Church-sanctioned reason to refuse their husbands, which some use strategically, but it also means you're essentially employing a celibate woman to perform an intimate physical act with your child. The psychosexual complexity of this arrangement seems to escape everyone involved, or maybe they just prefer not to examine it too closely. You're required to police the wet nurse's behavior obsessively. She can't drink wine. It will make the baby drunk. She can't eat spicy foods. They'll give the baby colic. She can't experience strong emotions. They'll sour the milk. Some households keep wet nurses in virtual imprisonment, monitoring every bite of food and every human interaction. You've become the warden of another woman's body, all in service of maintaining your own body's purity. The selection process for wet nurses reaches absurd heights. Beyond moral character and diet, you must consider physical appearance. Ugly nurses create ugly children. Astrological signs. Mars in the 3rd house is apparently bad for lactation. And even the nurse's dreams, nightmares contaminate milk. One manual suggests testing a nurse's milk by dropping it on a fingernail. If it rolls off quickly, it's too thin. If it sticks, it's too thick. The Goldilocks zone of perfect breast milk becomes another impossible standard. Some women resist this system in small ways. They secretly breastfeed at night when husbands are asleep. They claim their milk has dried up while continuing to nurse in private. Others develop mysterious illnesses that require them to feed their own babies for medical reasons. The lengths women go to in order to perform the basic mammalian function of feeding their young reveals how deeply the shame has penetrated. Historians still debate whether wet nursing was as universal among the nobility as sources suggest. Some evidence indicates that even wealthy women often nurse their own children, at least partially. Despite official disapproval, the emergence of nursing Madonnas in art, showing Mary breastfeeding Jesus, suggests some cultural pushback against the anti-breastfeeding message. The consequences of this system ripple through generations. Children raised by wet nurses often develop stronger emotional bonds with their nurses than their mothers, creating jealousy and conflict. The Church's solution? Shame mothers for their jealousy while continuing to promote the system that creates it. You watch your daughter reach for her nurse instead of you, and wonder if maintaining your noble status is worth this emotional price. The wet nursing industry reveals how the Church's body shame creates cascading systems of exploitation. Your shame about your lactating breasts leads to another woman's separation from her child, which leads to elaborate surveillance systems, which lead to more rules and restrictions and moral complications, all because someone decided that noble women's bodies were too pure to perform the function God supposedly designed them for. You're grinding herbs in your mortar when you hear the whispers starting again. She made a poultice for the baker's wife's monthlies. Her rosewater cleared up my daughter's complexion. That salve she gave me. Well, my husband hasn't left me alone since. Each remedy you share walks a dangerous line between helpful medicine and potential witchcraft accusation. The Church has decided that women's knowledge of their own bodies is inherently suspicious, possibly satanic, definitely requiring supervision. The criminalization of traditional women's medicine reveals the Church's deep fear of female knowledge. For generations, women have passed down remedies for everything from menstrual cramps to unwanted pregnancies. Now, suddenly, this wisdom is rebranded as witchcraft. The same herbs your grandmother used openly are now devil's potions if you're caught with them. The shift happens fast enough to give you whiplash. One day, you're a helpful neighbor. The next, you're a suspected sorceress. Take something as simple as your beauty routine, the rose water and white lead powder you use to achieve that fashionable pale complexion. If you're young and pretty, it's vanity. If you're old or unpopular, it's clearly an attempt to bewitch men. The henna hair that was fashionable last year is now evidence of moral corruption. Even basic hygiene becomes suspect. Why would a virtuous woman need to smell good unless she's trying to seduce someone? The double bind tightens like a noose. Use cosmetics and you're vain, possibly practicing love magic, and don't use them and you're failing in your wifely duty to remain attractive. The Church simultaneously condemns beauty practices as witchcraft, while shaming women who let themselves go. You're supposed to be naturally beautiful without any effort, eternally young without any assistance, perpetually attractive without actually trying to attract. The menstrual remedies generate particular scrutiny. Anything that might regulate your cycle, ease cramping, or, heaven forbid, prevent conception, is basically announcing you're in league with Satan. But here's the hypocrisy. Wealthy women's physicians prescribe the exact same herbs that get poor women burned as witches. Pennyroyal, tansy, and rue are medicine when a university-trained man dispenses them, but witchcraft when you grow them in your garden. You learn to hide your knowledge, speaking in codes and metaphors. Moon tea for menstrual issues, husband's friend for fertility aids, morning remedy for the herbs that prevent pregnancy from taking hold. The recipes are passed in whispers, written in symbols, hidden in prayer books. An entire underground network of women's medicine operates beneath the Church's nose. Protected by mutual necessity and shared danger, the investigation methods for suspected beauty witchcraft reach absurd levels. Authorities search homes for suspicious items, mirrors, vanity. perfumes, seduction, herbs, potions, even combs, enchanted to capture men's souls. Apparently, you've heard of women interrogated for hours about their bathing habits, their hair care routines, their methods for keeping skin soft. The fact that investigators seem unusually interested in these intimate details isn't lost on anyone. Some beauty practices get specifically labeled as Jewish or Muslim influence, adding religious persecution to misogyny, using kohl around the eyes, clearly learned from infidels, removing body hair, a suspicious foreign practice. The church creates hierarchies of acceptable versus satanic beauty practices based largely on which cultures they want to demonize this week. Your appearance becomes a theological battlefield. The fertility-related accusations carry the highest stakes. Help a woman conceive, and you might be celebrated. Help her avoid conception, and you're murdering potential Christians. The same woman who begs you for moon tea to space her pregnancies might be the first to accuse you of witchcraft if the authorities come calling. Fear makes hypocrites of everyone, and the church counts on that fear to maintain control. Historians still debate how many women died for the crime of knowing traditional medicine. The witch trials that will explode in later centuries have their roots in this medieval suspicion of women's bodily knowledge. Every herbalist burned, every midwife tortured, every wise woman silenced represents centuries of accumulated wisdom lost to religious paranoia. But the knowledge persists. Stubborn as weeds in a garden, women continue to grow their herbs, mix their remedies, share their wisdom. They adapt to the new reality, adding prayers to their potions, claiming divine visions taught them recipes, hiding medical knowledge inside acceptable domestic skills. If the church wants to call healing witchcraft, then witches there'll be, saving lives in the shadows. The beauty practices evolve too, becoming more subtle, more defensible. Instead of obvious cosmetics, you use health treatments that happen to improve appearance. Instead of love potions, you prepare digestive aids that happen to include aphrodisiac herbs. The resistance takes the form of malicious compliance, following the letter of the law while preserving the spirit of women's knowledge. You continue grinding your herbs, adding a prayer for protection, not from the ailments you're treating, but from the authorities who would punish you for treating them. The real witchcraft is how the church has transformed healing into heresy, beauty into blasphemy, and women's wisdom into wickedness. But they can't stop women from bleeding, birthing, aging, and dying. And as long as those experiences need tending, women will find ways to tend them. Accusations be damned. You're standing at the convent gates, bundle in hand, making a choice that feels simultaneously like escape and imprisonment. The Mother Superior eyes you with the calculating gaze of someone who's seen dozens of women flee here, some running from violent husbands, others from unwanted marriages, a few genuinely called by God, and many simply desperate for an alternative to the suffocating rules of secular life. Welcome, child, she says, and you wonder if this cage will prove any better than the one you're leaving. The convent presents a paradox that would make philosophers weep. Here, in this community of women who've renounced their sexuality, you might find more freedom than you ever had as a wife or daughter. You can learn to read and write, skills forbidden to most secular women. You can manage property, conduct business, even preach to other women. Of course, the very act of rejecting your role as wife and mother grants you access to powers otherwise reserved for men. But first, there's the testing period. The church needs to ensure you're joining for the right reasons, spiritual devotion, not escape from an angry father or pregnant belly. You undergo weeks of interrogation about your calling, your virginity or lack thereof. your family's financial situation. They're particularly interested in that last part. Convents need dowries just like husbands do. And a wealthy woman fleeing to God brings more divine favor than a poor one. The initial adjustment shocks you. You thought you were escaping the church's bodily restrictions, but convent life doubles down on physical denial. The food is deliberately bland and scarce. Flavor might inspire lust. You sleep on boards with a single rough blanket. Comfort weakens spiritual resolve. Cold water only for washing. Warm baths are practically orgies. Your body, already trained to shame in the secular world, faces new levels of mortification. Yet within these restrictions, strange freedoms emerge. Without husbands to serve or children to tend, you have time, great swaths of it for prayer. Yes, but also for study, creation, thought. You watch sisters illuminating manuscripts with steady hands, composing music, writing theological treatises. One elderly nun shows you her secret project, a medical text recording treatments for women's ailments, preserved here where male physicians can't destroy it. The hierarchy within convents creates its own political dramas. Noble-born nuns often live in relative comfort, with servants and private cells, while poor sisters scrub floors and tend gardens. You navigate complex power structures that mirror the outside world's class divisions. The Mother Superior might preach equality before God, but Sister Margaret's rich family donation buys her exemption from kitchen duty. Some convents develop reputations that would scandalize the bishops who supposedly oversee them. You hear whispers about communities where learning flourishes too freely, where sisters debate theology like university scholars, where rules about silence and submission get creatively interpreted. Other convents gain darker reputations, places where discipline crosses into cruelty, where the Mother Superior's word is law, where young nuns disappear into prayer cells and emerge broken. The intellectual life available in better convents intoxicates you. Libraries full of books you'd never access as a secular woman. Discussions about philosophy, natural science, even anatomy. Some bold abbesses commission translations of Greek and Arabic texts, claiming they need them for medical work. You realize that by rejecting your sexual role, you've gained access to your mind in ways that would be impossible outside these walls. But the surveillance continues in new forms. Your spiritual life faces constant scrutiny. Too much enthusiasm in prayer might indicate hysteria or, worse, mystical visions that challenge church authority. Too little suggests you're here for wrong reasons. You must perform perfect piety, devoted but not fanatical, obedient but not servile, pure but not prideful about it. The mental exhaustion of this performance rivals anything you faced in secular life. Historians still argue about whether convents represented liberation or another form of patriarchal control. Evidence supports both views. Yes, you're still under male authority, bishops, confessors, the Pope himself, but daily life is managed by women. And that creates spaces for autonomy unimaginable outside. Some abbesses wield power equivalent to feudal lords, controlling vast estates and commanding respect from princes. The particular friendships that develop between nuns create their own complications. The Church strictly forbids these intense emotional bonds, recognizing, perhaps correctly, that love between women might satisfy needs that should drive them to God alone. You watch pairs of sisters separated, transferred to different convents, punished for the crime of caring too much for each other. The effort to prevent any form of human intimacy, even platonic, reveals the Church's fear of women finding fulfillment outside male-defined structures. You discover that convent life, marketed as escape from sexuality, actually intensifies the focus on bodily control. Every appetite must be monitored. every sensation interpreted for spiritual meaning. The simple act of enjoying sunlight on your face during garden work becomes suspect. Are you taking pleasure in God's creation or indulging sensual desires? The distinctions grow so fine that existence itself seems sinful, yet women continue to choose this life, and not always from desperation. For some, the convent offers genuine spiritual fulfillment. For others, it's the closest thing to a women's university available. For many, it's simply the least bad option in a world that offers women so few choices. You make your peace with the contradictions, finding freedom in submission, power in powerlessness, and sisterhood in an institution designed to isolate. You're lying in bed next to your husband, both of you terrified to move. The church's latest proclamation has reached your village. Only one sexual position is acceptable in God's eyes, and it's the one designed to make conception most likely, while ensuring you experience as little pleasure as possible. Any deviation, you on top, standing, or God forbid, from behind like animals, could result in deformed children, demonic possession, or immediate damnation. Your marriage bed has become a theological minefield, where one wrong move could damn your eternal soul. The church's position on positions, pun absolutely intended by some medieval scribe, probably, reaches levels of absurdity that would be hilarious if the consequences weren't so severe. Theologians spend countless hours debating which angles of penetration align with God's will. They produce detailed manuals explaining that the natural position, man on top, woman beneath, facing each other, mirrors the hierarchy of creation. Any variation disrupts cosmic order and invites Satan into your bedroom. The conception theories tied to sexual positions reveal spectacular medical ignorance. Church-approved physicians claim that female pleasure prevents conception because the womb becomes too hot and burns up the seed. Therefore, the ideal position minimizes women's stimulation, ensuring a cool, calm womb ready for baby making. Other doctors argue the opposite, that female orgasm is necessary for conception because it draws the seed upward. These contradictory theories create a situation where you're damned either way. Experience pleasure, and you're either preventing pregnancy, sinful, or proving you're a whore, also sinful. You learn about the inspection practices in some regions where midwives examine pregnant women to determine what positions led to conception. A child born with a birthmark, clearly conceived in sin. Twins, obviously the result of excessive passion. A difficult birth. God's punishment for creative positioning. These post hoc explanations for normal variations in pregnancy and childbirth add layers of guilt to already dangerous experiences. The enforcement mechanisms range from laughable to terrifying. Some priests actually demonstrate approved positions using carved wooden figures during pre-marriage counseling. Others distribute diagrams that look like the world's least erotic instruction manuals. You've heard of confession manuals that include a numbered list of positions, allowing priests to efficiently catalogue sins without having to describe them. Did you commit number 7? Becomes code for acts that would make both confessor and penitent blush to articulate. But here's where medieval creativity shines. The loopholes. Technically, the church mainly prohibits positions that waste seed or prevent conception. So infertile couples, pregnant women, and postmenopausal pairs theoretically have more freedom. Except many theologians close this loophole by declaring any non-procreative sex inherently sinful, regardless of fertility status. The mental gymnastics required to determine what's allowed in your specific situation would exhaust a canon lawyer. The class distinctions in position enforcement reveal familiar hypocrisies. Noble couples often receive dispensations for health reasons, bad backs requiring modified positions. For instance, wealth buys theological flexibility. Meanwhile, peasant women do public penance for confessing to the same acts nobles perform with church blessing. The god of sexual positions apparently cares deeply about your social standing. Medical texts from the period accidentally reveal widespread disobedience to position restrictions. Physicians describe treating injuries that could only result from adventurous coupling, pulled muscles, fallen beds, suspicious bruises. One doctor's notes mention an epidemic of midnight back strain. That definitely wasn't from farming. The gap between official teaching and actual practice appears vast. Though the guilt and anxiety remain real, the position restrictions intersect weirdly with other sexual rules. Remember those calendars dictating when sex is allowed? Now add position requirements, conception obligations, and pleasure prohibitions. The acceptable sexual act becomes so narrow and specific that achieving it seems less likely than threading a needle during an earthquake while blindfolded. Yet you're still required to be constantly available to your husband, while somehow maintaining these impossible standards. Some women weaponize position rules for their own protection. "Oh, we couldn't possibly do that. It's sinful," becomes a way to refuse acts they find unpleasant or painful. Others claim religious visions warning against specific positions, using the church's own authority against husbands' demands. The system designed to control women's sexuality occasionally provides tools for resistance, though always at the cost of reinforcing the underlying shame. Historians still debate how seriously medieval couples took position restrictions. Court records show relatively few prosecutions for position violations compared to other sexual sins, suggesting either widespread compliance or, more likely, mutual agreement to keep bedroom specifics private. The fact that population growth continued despite these restrictions indicates that medieval couples found ways to reproduce within or around the rules. The psychological impact of position restrictions adds another layer to medieval sexual dysfunction. Imagine trying to maintain arousal while mentally cataloguing whether your current angle aligns with theological requirements. The self-consciousness and anxiety would challenge anyone's ability to perform, let alone conceive. The church creates the very sexual problems it claims to solve, then offers more rules as the cure. You and your husband develop your own strategies, quick encounters that technically comply, creative interpretations of natural, and mutual agreements about what definitely doesn't need confessing. The marriage bed becomes a space of negotiation between desire, duty, and damnation. Like so many medieval women, you learn to navigate between what the church demands and what human nature requires. Finding small rebellions in the dark, you're standing naked at the church door in February, shivering as the entire village walks past you to Mass. Your crime? The priest caught you using herbs to prevent your 7th pregnancy in as many years. Now you must endure 3 Sundays of this public humiliation, holding a candle that burns your fingers, while your neighbors alternate between pity and righteous satisfaction. This is just the beginning of your penance. After the public display comes months of fasting, prayer, and worst of all, the complete social isolation that follows such spectacular shame. The public penance rituals for women's sexual sins transform private matters into community theatre, while your husband, equally guilty of whatever act you're being punished for, might get away with extra prayers or a private confession. You're put on display like a cautionary tale. The gendered nature of these punishments isn't subtle. Women's bodies, already considered more sinful, require more dramatic correction to serve as examples to others. The specific penances vary by sin, but share a common thread of bodily mortification. Caught in adultery, you might have to crawl on your knees around the church, stones cutting into your flesh, while reciting prayers, used contraception, bread and water fasting for months, your body wasting away as public proof of your repentance. The physical suffering is meant to purify, but it also serves as visible warning to other women who might consider similar sins. The ritualized nature of these punishments creates a grotesque calendar in village life. Everyone knows that Margaret will be at the church door next Sunday, that Anne's crawling penance happens at noon, that Catherine's year of wearing rough sackcloth begins at Easter. Your shame becomes scheduled entertainment, something for gossips to anticipate and children to gawk at. The temporal extension of punishment ensures your sin stays fresh in everyone's memory for months or even years. Some penances involve elaborate props and costumes. You might be required to wear a special garment marking your sin, a yellow cross for heresy, a striped hood for prostitution, distinctive badges for various sexual transgressions. These visual markers follow you everywhere, transforming daily activities into extended humiliation. Buying bread at market becomes an ordeal when everyone can see your shame literally written on your clothes. The confession to penance pipeline reveals how private admissions become public spectacles. What you whisper in the confessional booth on Saturday manifests as theatrical punishment on Sunday. The priest holds extraordinary power to transform your secrets into community knowledge. Some women learn to confess strategically to visiting priests who don't know local dynamics, hoping for lighter, more private penances. But here's where it gets particularly twisted. The public nature of women's penance often involves sexual humiliation that seems to defeat its supposed purpose. Standing naked or nearly naked in public, crawling in positions that expose your body, wearing garments that emphasize your female form. These punishments seem designed to inspire the very lust they supposedly cure. You notice how many men find reasons to loiter near the church during women's public penances. The social consequences extend far beyond the formal punishment period. Your family bears shared shame. Your daughters become unmarriageable. Your sons face mockery. Your husband might lose business connections. The economic impact of public penance can destroy entire households. Some women find themselves forced into actual prostitution after being punished for suspected prostitution. Their reputations so destroyed that no respectable work remains available. Resistance takes various forms. Wealthy women sometimes negotiate private penances through substantial donations. Others develop mysterious illnesses that prevent public display. Some communities quietly rebel against excessive punishments. You hear of villages where neighbors form protective circles around punished women, blocking them from view while technically allowing the penance to proceed. The penance manuals used by priests reveal disturbing obsessions. Pages upon pages detail specific punishments for microscopic variations in sexual sins. The position you used, the day it happened, whether you experienced pleasure, whether conception resulted. Each factor adjusts the penance equation. The mathematical precision applied to calculating shame would impress an accountant. Historians still debate whether public penance actually deterred behavior or simply drove it underground. Evidence suggests that communities with the most theatrical punishments didn't have lower rates of sexual sins, just better hidden ones. The spectacle of punishment might have served more to reinforce power structures than actually change behavior. The psychological warfare of public penance extends to anticipation and aftermath, knowing your punishment is coming. Counting down days until your public humiliation begins proves almost as torturous as the event itself. Then, after formal penance ends, informal shunning continues. You're forever marked as the woman who stood naked at the church door, who crawled through the market, who wore the shameful badge. Some women transform their punishment into a form of protest. They perform their penance with such dignity that it shames the shamers. Others use their public platform to speak truths normally silenced, confessing not just their own sins, but the circumstances that led to them, the failures of husbands and priests, and communities that create impossible situations for women. You complete your required Sundays at the church door. But the real penance continues indefinitely. Every knowing look, every whispered conversation that stops when you approach, every child warned to stay away from you. These informal punishments last long after the church declares you officially forgiven. The spectacular nature of women's public penance ensures that sexual sins become permanent scarlet letters in the medieval social fabric. You're huddled in the back room of the midwife's cottage, watching her grind pennyroyal and tansy into a fine powder. Around you, other women wait their turn, some seeking remedies for too many pregnancies too fast, others desperate to conceive, a few needing help with monthly irregularities that everyone understands means an unwanted pregnancy. This underground network of women's knowledge operates in direct defiance of church law, passing ancient wisdom through whispers and coded recipes, keeping alive what authorities would burn to destroy. The remedies themselves range from benign to dangerous, effective to wishful thinking. Queen Anne's lace seeds, chewed daily, supposedly prevent conception. Rue tea brings on delayed menses. Ergot of rye can expel an early pregnancy, but might also kill you. The dosages are crucial. Too little and nothing happens. Too much and you hemorrhage. Women die trying to control their own reproduction, but they keep trying because the alternative, pregnancy after pregnancy until their bodies break, seems worse than the risk. The knowledge passes through intricate networks that would impress modern spies. Recipes hide inside psalters, pressed between pages of approved prayers. Herbs grow in kitchen gardens disguised among culinary plants. Code words evolve constantly, bringing down the flowers, removing obstructions, restoring natural flow. A simple conversation about gardening at the well might actually be detailed contraceptive advice. The church suspects, but can rarely prove these exchanges. You learn about the traveling women who carry knowledge between villages, often disguised as pilgrims or peddlers. They bring new remedies and techniques from distant places. Maria, the ribbon seller, actually trades in more than decorative goods. Her ribbons come wrapped around packets of herbs, each color indicating a different remedy. The red ribbons are especially popular among young wives, though officially they're just especially pretty for feast days. The pleasure techniques shared in these networks would scandalize any priest foolish enough to overhear. Women who've discovered ways to find satisfaction despite the church's position. Restrictions pass their knowledge carefully to trusted friends. Sometimes it's mechanical, angles and pressures and timing. Sometimes it's herbal, plants that increase sensitivity or arousal. Always it's dangerous. Admitting to seeking or experiencing pleasure could mean public penance or worse. The midwives serve as unofficial priestesses of this shadow religion of women's bodily knowledge. They know which phase of the moon makes conception most likely, how to tell if a baby will be male or female, ways to turn a breech birth. Their knowledge comes from generations of observation and practice, far more reliable than university-trained physicians who've never actually witnessed a birth. Yet they practice in constant fear of accusations of witchcraft. Some remedies serve multiple purposes, providing plausible deniability. That herb garden with so much fennel and parsley, officially for cooking, actually for promoting menses. The vinegar douches recommended for general hygiene that happen to create an inhospitable environment for conception. The vigorous horseback riding prescribed for constitution strengthening that sometimes dislodges early pregnancies. Women become experts at maintaining innocent explanations for suspicious activities. The economic network supporting this underground knowledge reveals surprising sophistication. Women pool resources to help each other afford remedies. They create informal insurance systems, contributing small amounts regularly, so funds exist when someone needs expensive or dangerous help. Some convents, despite official church positions, quietly provide sanctuary for women recovering from difficult procedures or hiding from authorities. The risks of participating in these networks go beyond individual punishment. Entire communities of women can face investigation if authorities discover their activities. You've heard of villages where dozens of women were interrogated about their knowledge of herbs, their conversations about pregnancy, their assistance to neighbors. The bonds of mutual protection must be stronger than the fear of torture and death. But the knowledge persists because the need persists. Every woman who watches a friend die in her 15th childbirth, who sees a neighbor forced to bear her rapist's child, who feels her own body breaking under reproductive demands, understands why these networks matter. The church offers prayers and suffering. The underground offers practical solutions. However dangerous, historians still struggle to quantify these networks because successful secret systems leave few records. The evidence emerges mainly from persecution, trial records, confessions under torture, accusations by enemies, but the persistence of traditional remedies, passed through generations despite centuries of suppression, suggests these networks were far more extensive and effective than official sources acknowledge. The psychological impact of having access to forbidden knowledge transforms how you see yourself. You're not just a passive vessel for reproduction anymore. You have options, however limited and dangerous. The simple act of choosing to prevent conception, to end a pregnancy, to seek pleasure, represents a fundamental rebellion against the system designed to control you. As you leave the midwife's cottage with your small packet hidden in your market basket, you feel the weight of centuries of women's resistance. Every remedy shared, every technique whispered, every woman helped despite the danger represents a link in an unbreaking chain of female solidarity. The church may control the public sphere, but in darkness and secrecy, women continue to claim ownership of their own bodies. The candle burns low as our story winds down, and you've witnessed the exhausting reality of being a medieval woman under the church's intimate surveillance, from calendars dictating when you could touch your husband to public shamings for seeking pleasure, from wet nurses replacing your maternal bond to convents offering intellectual freedom at the cost of physical denial. Every aspect of female existence was regulated, restricted, and resented. Yet through it all, women resisted, creating underground networks of knowledge, finding loopholes in impossible rules, and maintaining their humanity despite systems designed to deny it. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps thank whatever cosmic forces you believe in that your bedroom is no longer subject to ecclesiastical oversight. The medieval church's obsession with controlling women's bodies created centuries of unnecessary suffering. But it also revealed an essential truth. You cannot legislate away human nature. You can only drive it into the shadows where it grows stronger and more defiant. Sweet dreams. And may your slumber be untroubled by thoughts of confession manuals or public penance.